I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we get to this edition of the show, I just want to promote Wall Street Window, a website maintained by Mike Swanson that provides valuable insights on both financial markets and geopolitics. It's been around since 2003, and its slogan is "Be in the Know," and I highly recommend it as daily reading. So go on over to wallstreetwindow.com and keep yourself informed. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Gunnar, Mark, Alexander, Catherine, Tilo, Emilia, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, David H., Y. Kellerman, Saaded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we're going to be speaking with two figures involved with the Uncommitted New Jersey campaign and Rutgers University student encampment. If you're unfamiliar with the Uncommitted campaign, it's calling on Democratic Party voters to choose uncommitted in the primary. This has gained a lot of criticism from folks who say that this is only helping the Republicans, and especially MAGA. We'll discuss that in the conversation to follow. We'll also have a bit of discussion about a number of things. This is really a free-flowing conversation. You may find things you disagree with that I say, that my guests say, but I think it's a really interesting dialogue. So, with that in mind, let's get to the conversation. And remember, the primary in New Jersey is just a few days away on June 4th. So, with that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome to Parallax Views. Two guests that I'm going to allow to introduce themselves. I don't want to botch any names, but they're from the Uncommitted New Jersey campaign and the student encampment at Rutgers University. How are you doing? And let's get introductions out of the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. I guess it's my name that is mainly the problem here. It's a long Greek name, right? So my name is Elektra Kostopoulou, and as the name suggests, I'm of a Greek origin. I'm actually a recent immigrant to the US. I came about 11 years ago. I'm a professor of history. I specialize in the broader Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, with a focus on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And I've been teaching at the Federated Department of History at Rutgers, Newark, and NJIT for about 6 years now. I'm here, however, today mainly as an organizer and a delegate for the Uncommitted campaign, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Kale, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, sure thing. Hi, I'm Kale Yost. I'm a recent graduate of Rutgers Law School in Rutgers, Newark, New Jersey. I have been involved in the encampment that we started at Rutgers Newark If I'm correct, I believe we're on day 27 of the encampment. It's still going strong. Um, and so I'm here to talk a little bit about that experience and the interrelatedness of the encampment and the encampment movement as a whole, to Uncommitted and the broader coalition that is forming here in the United States and around the world.
So I don't know if you guys want to should we start with talking about the encampment, or should we start with talking about the Uncommitted campaign? Um, I'll let you take it, Elektra. Where do you think we should start?
We can start with the Uncommitted campaign because this is what, chronologically speaking, came first. So I can share a little bit of the background of this whole initiative. It really started in a very, very spontaneous way. At the beginning, it was nothing but a WhatsApp group, right? As the horrors we are all witnessing almost on a daily basis now continue to unfold in Gaza, 4 months into that situation around December. Some of us, out of frustration and despair, the lack of any meaningful action, people who were protesting, trying to raise their voices, but didn't see much happening, especially on the end of the Biden administration regarding changing our approach to this whole situation. So some of us out of despair mainly came together and started venting and sharing thoughts and ideas. And then Michigan happened, right? The Uncommitted campaign of Michigan, which started as a symbolic, very loud statement. And then it became a national movement. A number of states would join into this broader, very spontaneous movement. And we decided here in New Jersey to do the same. New Jersey is the last state to hold the primaries. June 4th, that's an important date to remember for your listeners as well. June 4th is the it's the date of the Democratic primaries here in New Jersey. So the idea was to organize and to make a loud statement here in New Jersey as well. As we all know, it's traditionally considered New Jersey that is the bluest of the blue, right? A state that doesn't really matter because it always vote for the Democratic Party. And as far as the primaries go, it's always the last one. So it does not really matter from the perspective of political calculations and tactics. This year, however, we are trying to make the argument that everything matters, including but not limited to New Jersey, and to make a very, very loud statement as to how dissatisfied, and that's putting it very, very mildly, traditional Democratic voters and large groups who are likely to vote for the Democratic Party are with the Biden administration in general, and how frustrated, how outraged so many of us feel with our forced complicity in this horrendous genocide that is now unfolding in Gaza, to the detriment of really everybody involved. It is a disaster for the whole region. It is a disaster for the United States of America. It has resulted in our complete isolation internationally. It has triggered all kinds of unconstitutional reactions and strategies that are coming to the fore internally. So what's happening right now under the auspices of the Biden administration, it's a disaster that it's quite frankly inexplicable. And the polls are very clear, the numbers are very clear. The majority of traditional Democratic voters are not okay with it. So there is a very clear disconnect, right, between the Biden administration and Biden as the nominee and the voting base of the Democratic Party. And are we willing to throw the election if the administration does not get the message? Some of us are more than willing to do precisely that. So everything for me with the Uncommitted started there. A very spontaneous movement, and I can provide more detail if you want as we continue our discussion. And then this is where the Uncommitted campaign, when the student encampment started to meet with broader mobilizations of students, faculty, and like society in general here in New Jersey, but also, I would argue, nationally, right, across the United States. We all want the same thing. We all try to deliver a very loud message in the name of very basic concepts, really. Democracy, international law, basic human decency. It is truly devastating. And simultaneously, I do believe this is a turning point, an existential point for the United States of America and for the whole world. This is the discussion we're having with Kale right before we met with you. Things are changing on a global scale. Things are changing internally. The situation in Gaza has become so extreme, so devastating, so truly infuriating and offensive to all of us, the handling of it all by the Biden administration. Who, by the way, as a useful reminder, came to power promising to end the forever wars and to restore international peace, and our standing as a superpower that claims to represent human rights in a global context, right, and to restore normalcy. And what we are witnessing right now is unprecedented in multiple ways, disastrous, first and foremost, just the cruelty of it all as far as the main victims of this tragedy, the Palestinians, are concerned, is just, I believe it's impossible for anybody, any normal human who is exposed to this, to have any other reaction but to be emotionally overwhelmed, the cruelty of it all, and the fact that it's broadcasted live on social media, because this is the 21st century, is just too much. And at the same time, other than the real situation, which is, of course, the center of attention, this is a disaster for American interests, for the American democracy, any notion of it. And at this point, it is really hard to understand what is the actual motivation of the Biden administration. So this is still a procedural democracy, and we feel very strongly that this is a conversation our government and presumptive nominee has to have with us, the voters, as to the lack of any notion of representation or even acknowledging the fact that what's happening right now does not represent the majority of American people, and internationally it results to the full isolation of the United States of America, with disastrous potential implications that could include triggering a regional confrontation, World War III. Like there are scary scenarios out there that hopefully can be avoided, but are becoming increasingly plausible. So that would be somewhat of an introduction on my end.
Do you guys want to address? So the criticism I always hear of the Uncommitted campaign is, this election between Biden and Trump, it's a question of democracy, and I guess the criticism is you guys are going to be handing Trump an electoral victory through this. How do you want to respond to the critics?
Kale, would you like to say something before I respond to that?
Sure, I can say something. I think it's an argument that needs to be taken seriously, whether we want to do work that's going to, in effect, help Trump to win. But I think that there's some very strong arguments that lend in favor of our position. I think probably the strongest point on that issue is to look at uh, terminal results. And by what I mean by that is mainly a nuclear exchange or a nuclear war. That is terminal. And if we reach that point in the world, all the other issues don't necessarily matter because there's not a humanity to have the issues. Um, and if we look at that one issue, the Biden administration has clearly been a complete disaster. We see issues all around the world on every single corner of the globe that have raised to tensions that have not been seen. Uh, and that one issue, I think, is enough to justify a protest against politicians that are leading the way on this. If there's one thing politicians care about, it's their self-interest. And if there aren't consequences for the actions that have led to this unconscionable moment in history, with the genocides happening in Gaza and all of the other issues and conflicts that are possible to spin out of control, then what can't be done? What are politicians going to be held accountable for? We know what the Biden administration is going to do. They're going to continue the path that they've continued, which has been to destroy the state of Ukraine, to raise the possibility of a direct conflict with China, and to allow for Israel to completely nearly destabilize the entire region in the Middle East. We'll wait to see what happens with that. And that cannot be allowed. We're not sure what Trump will do. We do know what the Biden administration will do, and it's completely unacceptable. And so this is to send a message that if our politicians take these actions, they will lose their jobs. There have to be consequences, and on the most important issues, I really don't see much of a difference between Biden and Trump.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's very well said. Let me clarify something as far as the primaries are concerned, right? Because this is what the uncommitted vote is mainly all about. We are inviting people again. We're trying to form a broader coalition. This is like a final hope that the message will be delivered and received by the Democratic Party, and that they will change their ways before it's too late. So people can vote for the uncommitted movement during the primaries and then vote for whomever they want. They can vote for Biden, they can vote for Trump, they can vote for a third candidate. And
in other words, this is an attempt to maybe send a message to the Democratic Party and even the Biden administration that, we're serious about this issue and we want you to change course.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say it's a twofold message, right? So the first and most important and most inclusive aspect of that message is precisely what you said. It's an attempt to, we're playing chicken at this point, right? Really, to give the message that so many of us are outraged that you're risking losing the election to Trump. And we can all agree that Trump is a disaster. There's no doubt about that. But it is a message towards the Democratic Party that your candidate, because he's running unopposed, right? And most of us did not really think much about it before everything started. So he's running unopposed, and the message is that your candidate is a disaster and he's likely to lose to Trump. So some will give that message during the primaries and still vote for Biden. But I want to be very clear, a very big group of uncommitted voters, such as myself, at this point will absolutely not vote for Biden unless he changes course. And it doesn't look like he will be doing that anytime soon. So maybe it's a desperate hope at this point, but I should think that there must be somebody else who can replace that man. He has been a complete disaster. And as Kale puts it very, very nicely, we can all agree that Trump uses fascist rhetoric and that so many of his policies and engagement with socioeconomic issues have been completely grotesque, autocratic, and yes, dangerous to any notion of democracy within the United States of America. But this identification of the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, the Democratic establishment with the war industry is something that the Democrats at some point really need to accept and face. There are many disastrous conflicts, right, and very tense situations that are unfolding as we speak everywhere in the world. Ukraine, as a case in point, Gaza, clearly there is tension over the issue of Taiwan in the Pacific, right? And we have this revival of a nonsensical Cold War rhetoric against everybody, Russia, China. We're not willing to directly fight for now, at least, but we are willing to cause chaos and revive our arms industry. And look, something that I bring up every single time, because to me it was so outrageously offensive, but also telling, was a statement Biden himself made addressing the American public at the beginning of what is now described by everybody as like the genocide in Gaza, right? So when the criticisms of his own handling of the situation started to accumulate, he addressed the nation telling us that we shouldn't complain because this is good for the American economy. These were his words as the leader of the global superpower, that we should not complain that babies and children and women are getting slaughtered with our money and our weapons, because we need to finance that industry. And according to him, because he clearly lives in a different century, this is the driving force of the American economy. He unapologetically so made that statement. So I believe that people who care about human rights, democracy, freedom of speech, that they want for their politicians to be accountable, right, should be very honest with themselves as to what this current Democratic administration represents at this point. Because the argument of the Trump boogeyman is a facile one and a particularly dangerous one at this point. Of course, Trump is dangerous, but honestly, I believe he's at this point significantly less dangerous than the sinister, hidden racism and warmongering of one group within the Democratic Party. I wouldn't say it's everybody, but it looks like this is the dominant group right now. And because it is hidden, because it is not as grotesque, as crude, as vulgar, as irrational at times as the Trump grandstandings, I believe it is the real problem that we need to engage with if we take our democracy as we claim seriously.
We've seen that a little bit too with, as an example, I know Democrats that want to, I guess, court the sort of Nikki Haley contingent of the Republicans. Oh, maybe we can get some of these people to flip over to voting for Biden because they're not big fans of, Trump. But it's worth saying, first, Nikki Haley has endorsed Trump now. And also this is a woman who, basically just wrote on an Israeli artillery shell, finish them, which is just grotesque. But you have Democrats that want to court the Nikki Haley voters. It's kind of, I think it's telling.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's surreal, honestly. And the Republican Party, the statements that are made left and right, they're threatening the ICJ, the ICC in a mafia-like fashion, right? This is how the mob operates. You and your families, like, who sends letters to judges that their families are not going to be safe if they dare to enforce the law? the elected government of a so-called democracy or the opposition. This is what mobsters do, right? So we have reached such a surreal state of extreme disconnect. I think ideological. I'm laughing out of frustration, honestly. And the illogical nature of all of these discussions that we're having. We're having a discussion as to whether we should stop the slaughter of babies and children, which is a disaster according to everybody who knows anything about the issue for Israel as well, by the way, right? Even if we're thinking about Israeli security and like there is an argument to be made there, it wouldn't be my argument, but there is an argument to be made there. This is clearly a disaster for Israel as well. So this is an unprecedented in cruelty and irrationality slaughter that is reminiscent of World War I, the Armenian genocide, reminiscent of the collapse of the then Ottoman Empire. This is what dynastic empires in decline do, usually right before their ultimate collapse. So we're witnessing that, and we're having a debate in the 21st century as to whether this should continue or not, with our government blocking, at this point, the whole world from stopping, for starters, the massacres, and then trying to decide what the day after is going to look like. I mean, literally, that's what we're doing. We take a position in favor of continuing a slaughter that doesn't benefit anybody but potentially Israel's Netanyahu, who is like too deep in to stop at this point, and the arms industry. I don't think there is any other rational explanation. It certainly does not help American Jews. It certainly does not help the Palestinian victims of these atrocities. It doesn't help Israel either if Israel were to survive as anything that resembles a democracy and, to live in peace and prosperity, surrounded by its neighbors, all of whom, by the way, are turning against Israel. We're losing every single alliance we have established by, controlling dictatorships, stopping popular uprisings and all that. Even the most autocratic dictatorships in the region that are our traditional allies are recognizing that this is like too much. We cannot oppress the just feelings of frustration of 95% of our population, even if we are an autocratic regime. And somehow our democratically elected government does not get the message. Saudi Arabia, the crown prince is getting the message. Egyptian dictators are getting the message, but our democratically elected government is not getting the message that this is not okay with the majority of your voters and your people that you allegedly represent. And what are you going to do? Terrorize all of us, suppress every reaction, violate any notion of legality or even any notion of reason by arguing all kinds of things that are completely irrational and straightforward lies, gaslight more than 300 million people into oblivion. It's really, quite frankly, unbelievable. It's an outrageous situation we find ourselves in.
I want to talk a bit more about the encampments, but before we do that, there were two things I wanted to touch upon. First, in the past few days, we've seen just what can only be described as a massacre in Rafah. I mean, it's utterly disgusting. Burned bodies, headless children. I mean, it's really disturbing, and I'm even noticing, mainstream Democrats saying, well, this is all gone too far now. And yet the Biden administration has responded with, initially they were quiet about it for quite some time. And now they're saying, well, we're going to let Israel investigate themselves on this. And I do think that we're reaching a breaking point for a lot of even mainstream Democrats. Are you guys noticing that as well? Kale, do you want to take that one, or Elektra?
maybe I can say a few words and then give it to Elektra. So I think that's absolutely accurate and correct. It really seems to be that the Biden administration is very incompetent, and that Biden is very incompetent. I can only make my assessment from the outside, but it seems like he probably is a true believer of the Zionist message and that he would like to see the Palestinians to be destroyed. And he's willing to help Israel as much as he possibly can to get to that point. Um, I also think it shows the absolute inability to understand the consequences for himself politically for pursuing this. Uh, he and his administration have shown to be very out of touch, and I think very unrealistic. And I think that's a very dangerous combination in a situation in that area of the world with a nuclear armed Israel, with a radical, zealous government, and with all the instabilities that are going around the world. Would be a lot, any one, which would be a lot for any administration to be handling competently.
I'm sorry. Chester here wanted to make a statement as well.
It's okay for people only hearing the audio version. Electra's cat is making an appearance.
He feels very strongly about the issue. Maybe he says that I am emotionally distressed. That's something that cats do better than humans. But yeah, precisely as you were saying, it's just what happened over this past weekend, right? Because the Biden administration, among other things, they're completely incompetent. It's a ridiculous joke at this point that this is the administration of the global superpower that could end the human civilization as we know it with our arsenal, right? So they keep talking about their like red lines. And I had a conversation with Netanyahu, and I told him that I won't provide it's really ridiculous. I'm trying to repeat the statements that the government is making, and I find myself struggling because of how ridiculous they sound. They had a conversation with Netanyahu, and they informed him that they won't provide the weapons to kill children in Rafah if he continues with the attack against Rafah. I won't provide the weapons that are usually used to do these types of things, to deal with this type of a situation. That was his exact wording. And I think that really is very important, the semiotics of it all, like how out of touch, how incompetent, how truly dangerous this administration has become, not only because they're clearly unapologetically in favor of a militarized to the teeth Israel that is representing American imperialism to the detriment of Jewish interests as well, I would like to argue. I mean, ideologically, this is where Biden stands, and there are many questions about his mental health these days. We have witnessed him on multiple occasions arguing that he was the vice president during COVID. That was one of the last things I happened to witness. Trump's vice president, I don't know what exactly he was talking about, like mixing the president of Mexico with the president of Egypt, addressing the French President Macron by using the name Mitterrand, which is a long gone French. I mean, it's a long.
The latest one for me was, did you guys catch that whole thing where Biden was talking about his uncle in World War II? His plane was downed, and he claimed that his uncle was eaten by cannibals in New Guinea. I'm like, are you just a pathological liar, man? I mean, it's
no, it's just it's really. And then the fact that we have the Biden campaign trying to convince all of us that we don't know what we're talking about, and somehow we do not understand the hidden brilliance and sparkle of that man, whom we witness on a continuous base now, just a pathetic state of he wouldn't be allowed to drive a car, and yet he's the leader of a global superpower that has nuclear weapons and decides international policy. It's just, but aside from his cognitive decline, which I believe is very, very clear, he comes to life when he talks about war. This is where Biden ideologically stands. Even when he was young, he supported every single disastrous war we ever fought, didn't he? He was one of the Democrats that supported the Iraq war, ideologically so. He has been consistently on the wrong side of history, and thereby it's not really a surprise that even in his senile state, he comes to life when it comes to like his obsession with like the American war machine. So is this the Democratic candidate of, again, an alleged superpower in the 21st century? It is ridiculous in lack of a better description. And yes, what happened over the weekend was just, we keep repeating that for months now. Devastating, outrageous, demoralizing, inhumane. Like watching these videos, it took me 3 days to even watch some of the footage that came out of these camps. I was like hearing about it and again reading the descriptions, and I'm forcing myself to do so because we have to. We can't just turn our backs to this just because it's uncomfortable to witness it when people are really experiencing this. So they burned alive sleeping children in the designated safe zone, where they have been displaced. Some of these families have been displaced twice, 3 times. These are the families that are following Israeli orders because they're trying to save their children, right? They're doing whatever they're told, despite the fact that it's so obviously genocidal. They were ordered to march from the north to the south. Israel cut their access to water and food from day one. They were a live, moving target. So is there a limit? We have been witnessing mass graves, people being buried alive, newborn children left to die and decay in incubators in hospitals, like journalists becoming a target, doctors being abducted, tortured. It's just, they have broken every single record of atrocity in recent history as to, these red lines. And the final red line was Rafah, right? That was the argument that if you go to Rafah, that's it for us. And of course, every time Netanyahu is told that by our very industrious and capable president, he does the exact opposite. He's going out of his way to humiliate Biden. It is truly outrageous. It is truly outrageous. So yes, they have crossed that line as well. In case there was any doubt as to whether this is the most brutal genocide in recent history, I believe it's abundantly clear, not only because the whole world says so, not only because every single legal expert in the world is saying so, but because there is no line left that they haven't crossed, unapologetically so. So are we going to continue witnessing the extermination of 2 million people right in front of our very own eyes with our weapons and money? And let me clarify this again, in case it's still unknown to some. This is our genocide. Netanyahu is just, clearly he's playing his own game and he's trying to realize his own greater mission in a very self-destructive way at this point, but he has no other options. Regardless, Netanyahu wouldn't have been able to do any of these things if we didn't provide, from day one, the weapons, the money. Hundreds of billions are taken from American taxpayers to finance these atrocities not only in Gaza, around the world, but we're focusing on Gaza right now for obvious reasons. So it's our weapons, our money, and most important in the case of Gaza and Israel, it's our political standing. The whole world has been trying to stop this. Really almost immediately because of how extreme the situation is. Even the most systemic courts in the world, such as ICC and ICJ, these courts are usually described as a bunch of bureaucrats. They don't have the power of enforcement, right? They represent the ideal of an international community that is very clearly serving only those in power. We all know what international law and these international institutions mean in the real world. And yet, even these systemic institutional actors, I know.
Cat's making an appearance again.
Are making, he wants to make a statement as well, I guess, are making a statement because of how extreme the situation is. So the whole world has been trying to at least stop the massacre. Not necessarily because they care about the Palestinians, but because there is global outrage. I would say that at this point, it's more than 80-90% of the global human population that feels very strongly about it. And this is not just an Arab or a Muslim issue. I mean, the Arab world and the Muslim world is clearly up in arms because they're slaughtering people who speak their language, who look like them. And the message we're giving them is we couldn't care less, right? Your own children could be slaughtered, burnt alive, beheaded right in front of your very eyes in a territory that has been occupied for more than a century now. They're prisoners who are getting executed, and we don't care because you're Arabs, because you're Muslims, because you're not as good as we are. That's the message we're giving to billions of people across the world. I'm sorry, but also within the so-called West, the Western Alliance, there are people who are outraged because some of us, naively so, the so-called Western democratic voters believe in the ideals we're told the West identifies with, right? Human rights, democracy. And when there is such an overt, unapologetic violation of every notion of human decency, obviously there is outrage among our students, among the younger people in particular, who feel very strongly about these ideals. So it's unattainable for Europe as well. And European leaders have the capacity to understand that. This is why we see even traditional allies of the United States of America now turning against us. Norway, Spain, Ireland, of course, recognize Palestine, as we all know. France is clearly a conservative actor in all this, but they're considering, right, moving away from this alliance of terror as well. And they're using increasingly so very strong words against the Biden administration. So we are losing everybody because apparently most other world leaders, out of self-preservation, are getting the message that their people are not okay with it. Sorry.
I wanted to give Kale a chance to talk about his experiences at the encampment. What has that been like, and what are some of the misunderstandings maybe that the media is pushing about the encampments?
Sure. I think, to start out with the interrelatedness of the message of the encampment, the work that we're doing with the bigger coalition that's forming in this country and around the globe against the current world order and the order of the United States, the hierarchy of power in the United States. Yeah, I heard a very sensible point that was made by Dr. Norm Finkelstein about Gaza being a metaphor for the struggles that we're all going through, especially people in the United States. Gaza, it's a postage stamp on the face of the earth. I mean, it's a small area, but yet the struggle, the atrocities, the unconscionable acts that are occurring represent in a way the struggle that we're all fighting against in the order of power in the world. Um, and what I mean by that is that it's the same industry of weapons manufacturing, of making money off of war, uh, of controlling the information that the American population, the world population, is able to get about conflicts or whatever corruptions that our leaders are making in our name and with our money and through our at our expense. Um, that this issue, which is seen on its face as a foreign issue in Gaza, uh, is being understood for the first time as not being a foreign issue. It's actually directly involving the United States, and we are directly complicit as a nation. I think that's a very important realization that we've had as a whole, as a public. And so from that point, the intersection of the encampment and the message that we're protesting to a foreign issue is very important and directly related to the coalition that's forming, which the Uncommitted campaign is a part of. I think that the Newark, New Jersey, Rutgers, Newark, New Jersey encampment specifically evidences a deeper interconnectedness that this issue has, in that we're calling for the divestment of the funds that Rutgers has that are contributing to, in substantial part, the genocide that Israel's committing. But we also are calling for, and this is something which is unique to our encampment, the reinvestment of the funds that are being divested into the community in Rutgers, Newark. This is really important because I think it goes to show the further interconnectivity of the oppression that the Palestinians are facing to the oppression that many people face here in the United States. It's the same system which takes the resources from people, rendering a housing crisis, rendering police oppression, hunger, luxury, education as a luxury in the United States that is involved in the oppression of Palestinians. So I think we really drive the nail all the way through with the message of our encampment. To talk about the experience on a day-to-day with the encampment, I think we have a very strong group of individuals from the community that have come together and done a lot to make a very well-rounded community. We have experienced organizers that have created a multifaceted approach to managing all the aspects that go into keeping a sustainable encampment going. We have very intelligent and smart people, such as Elektra, that have, given light and given truth to why this is important and why it's worth putting ourselves at risk to take the stance that we're taking. There's, of course, the weaponization of the Jewish identity that's waged against the encampment and every encampment in the United States as being an anti-Semitic attack. The reality, it could not be any further from the truth. We have religious services and ceremonies from all of the Abrahamic religions that we conduct on a daily basis for all people of all faiths. We have a strong opposition to any anti-Semitic hatred that is within the camp. We won't tolerate it. And we also hold a strong belief, and I think it's the correct position, that the weaponization of the Jewish identity against the Jewish people standing up against a genocide that's being committed in their name, it could not be any more anti-Semitic, and it could not be a bigger insult to a group of people, the Jewish people, that have endured such horrible atrocities in their own history. So I think we've come a long way. Our encampment has survived a long time, I think 27 days at this point, and a big part of that has to do with the fact that we are located in Newark. Newark is a city that has a long history of revolution against state oppression. In the 60s, there were the Newark riots that led to a significant amount of the city unfortunately being burned due to a revolution against state oppression through police violence and other forms of oppression that were being waged against primarily the African American population in Newark. That legacy is continued. the mayor of Newark gains his legitimacy as being the son of a Black Panther, who is radical in his approach to popular uprisings against police violence. And so the optics of sweeping the encampment, like what's happened in Columbia or every single encampment in New York City, is just intolerable for the mayor in his position. Um, and so our encampment specifically really shows a lot of the interconnectedness of these struggles. And it's really a beautiful thing.
I wanted to ask you, Kil, so when it, or both of you could answer this maybe, but I think for those of us involved in activism or just reporting on this, there could be a lot of diversity on opinion on different issues, even outside of Gaza. So you mentioned Ukraine earlier. I think we probably would have slightly different views on that. I'm a little bit colored because I have Ukrainian background. But the reason I mention this is because I think there's a lot of diversity of thought amongst all of us. And at times we can butt heads over one thing, but we can all agree on another. How is it that we can organize and keep ourselves focused on the message for one issue without letting other issues necessarily divide us?
Specifically on the
On
issue
Gaza.
on Gaza. Well, I think the first thing is that any person with basic morality is going to oppose genocide. Um, and there's been, I think, an argument which ought to be taken seriously, but it's an important argument about whether or not this is, you have to decide where you're going to put your efforts, right? So some people have argued, well, Ukraine, 500,000 Ukrainians have died on the field of battle in Ukraine, right? Which some might say, well, only 40,000 Palestinians have died, or there's a genocide occurring in Sudan, or look at the Congo, or look at all these other issues. So why are we focused on Gaza? Why is this so important? And why is this something which all of us should have and likely have an agreement on in the basic sense? I think that maybe the best answer is that this is just such a grotesque example of the rot that the American empire has and the decline that the American empire is going through. There's a lot that's at stake. I mean, you have Israeli government, which is absolutely out of control, that has nuclear weapons, that's trying to cause as much conflict as it possibly can with a completely incompetent American administration. Killing more children that's been killed in the past, I think, 4 years combined. All the wars across the entire world for the past 4 years, and in the name of with the United States giving all the diplomatic coverage. So, as an American, let's take the position that you don't care about foreign issues. This is not a foreign issue. This is directly involving the United States selling almost all of the weapons to Israel, taking all of the political damage diplomatically and on the world scale for supporting what Israel's doing, and risking the destabilization of the entire region, which would absolutely destroy the United States economy. If that region of the world spins out of control, if Iran gets involved, guess what? The United States economy is shot, and we're not prepared to deal with that type of a hit. Further than that, that entire region, most of the world is turning towards the east for trade. You've got China; it's a powerhouse in industry that's been focused on diplomacy all along, and they're very good at it. And so you've got actors all around the world that see China as a much stable trading partner. That also includes Russia, and they're winning the bids. And so if you only care about American self-interest, I mean, this is the worst thing for America that you could ask for.
I was more though thinking of, so I'll give a better example. I know people that are involved with pro-Palestinian activism that they may disagree on should there, at the end of the day, be a one-state or a two-state solution. But I think in some ways we have to get past, disagreements and build coalitions. And I think sometimes people get too caught up in well, I agree with this point, but not this point. We have to come together on like the things we agree on the most. Does that make sense? Like any coalition is going to have a lot of people with differing viewpoints, I guess is what I'm.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all agree on stopping the genocide for different reasons. I think one thing that, at least in America, a lot of people agree on is we don't want to send our money overseas to killing children. And so on that position alone, Electra and I were talking about this earlier, I think there's a lot of commonality. And on that one point, I think you can gather people to be committed to the issue. And so
That's why I think ceasefire now is such a powerful slogan right now.
I do. And I also think that um, there can be an emphasis on the recognition of the direction that the world is going one way or the other. Um, so the genocide at some point must stop. And then what's left the day after? Well, it seems to be at the current moment that the state of Israel will not continue to exist with the way that it's manifesting itself at the current moment. It's so damaged its reputation, and it's so damaged its ability to do diplomacy with other nations that it'll likely be largely cut out of trade agreements that are going to render the economy to depress, leading the country to depopulate, at which case there will have to be diplomacy for a one-state solution for the viability of the Israeli state to continue. So I think there's some realities here that one way or another, we're on board with whether we like it or not. And so,
And if I am to also step in here, first of all, I would like to address something. I'm not sure we disagree on the issue of Ukraine, right? Because what we were trying to say is that what's happening right now is a disaster for the Ukrainian people, and we care about Ukraine as much as we care about Gaza. We absolutely do care about like 500,000 victims. Like there is nobody left in Ukraine to fight anymore. This is just, so this is when we criticize the Biden administration, that does not negate the fact that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, that he's the aggressor in that particular situation. But you know what? He is a successful war criminal. He knows exactly what he's doing. And maybe there was a weakness of his that we were trying to take advantage of at the beginning of it all. We tried, it didn't work. Russia and autocratic Russia, Putin in particular, is strengthened. The more this continues, the better at this point for Putin. He had destroyed the internal opposition. He's because Russia also relies on the war industry. They're doing great. They have people to spare. He couldn't care less about how many Russians die. It's a much bigger country. It's a much more robust economy. But from the perspective of Ukraine, it's just devastating. Are we helping Ukrainians right now? I struggle to see how this is a defensible position. Maybe at the beginning of the war there was a momentum, but right now it's abundantly clear that this is hurting Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people are bleeding, and Vladimir Putin, the main aggressor, is strengthened by this situation. So why? What are we doing there? We are criticizing the mismanagement of it all, that again reveals the same indifference for the lives of Ukrainian people, right? The message we are giving everybody is that as long as we can upload our weapons somewhere and we can keep our industry moving, who cares about how many Ukrainians have to die? And this is, like, among other things, a coward's game. And at the end of the day, back to what Kale was saying, as somebody who is a recent immigrant to this country and a historian, there is something intriguing about the American side. I feel that on a very mainstream level, Americans identify nationalism still with us being the good guys internationally, right? I feel that that legacy of World War II, we are the power that defeated the Nazis and all that, is still very strong, and it resonates. I mean, clearly there was the Cold War and Vietnam and everything else that happened, but many Americans still seem to think that we have this positive influence over international relations. And as Kale was saying, like most Americans, regardless of where they're standing politically, are absolutely not okay with their billions being spent abroad, especially if what we're doing is killing children and devastating whole countries just to serve our own arms industry. Because honestly, this is what it comes down to. And I'm not saying that regional actors don't have agency or responsibility. Obviously, this is a multidimensional situation. Any of these very complex, conflictual context is multi-layered, multifaceted, and complex. But from the perspective of American foreign policy, the only rational explanation we can think of is that, and it was stated by the president himself, as I said before, is that this is good for our arms industry, which is such a parochial.
Yeah, I think what was it that he said that this is great because it's creating more jobs for workers, and it was.
It's great that we're slaughtering people in Gaza and Ukraine. Like that, I don't think we disagree on that, right? We agree that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. There is no doubt about that. But he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's strengthened by this other massacre that we are financing because it's good for the arms industry. And again, even from a financial perspective, it's such a 20th century approach to anything. Really, it is so ridiculous that it is offensive. I mean, yes, this is what FDR needed to do to get the US out of the Great Depression, maybe, right? Because that was our hard industry back in the day. But we do live in the 21st century, the so-called fourth industrial revolution and all that. This is not even where the money is. We can invest in different things, even from a very conservative capitalist perspective that is preoccupied with American self-interests. This is not where our interests as a country or even as a superpower lie. This is just a nonsensical, grotesque manifestation of complete incompetence. The way I see it and the way I put it, again, as a historian, is that we live in the 21st century, and because of these very fast changes that are now happening because of modern technology and everything else, the future has already arrived, and we are just governed by people who live in the past. And I doubt they have the ability to even appreciate how much the world has changed. They were raised with that Cold War mentality. They were raised to believe that this is what, fiscal calculations mean, even from the perspective of governmental influence. That's what they know, that's what they do. But they do live in a different century, and this is disastrous and devastating at this point. So we can build these broader coalitions. And quite frankly, yes, we can disagree on minor things. Back to your question, what's the choice for the day after? Well, it's not up to us to decide this, is it, right? We can all agree on certain ideals that we all want for all peoples, Muslim, Christians, Jewish, to have some basic human rights. Can we all agree on that? Can we all agree that we want for all of them to be safe, for all of them to be represented in any way that they choose in some type of government? Can we all agree that religion or race or any type of identity shouldn't be used to establish one group against the interests of the other? Is a federation sustainable at this point, right? There are many approaches we can take. A two-state solution, a federation, just one country with different communities. It's not up to us to decide that. As long as we agree on the fundamentals of what we allegedly stand for, not even from a revolutionary perspective, but from a conservative, democratic, pro-human rights, liberal perspective, really. Can we all agree that it's not okay to massacre children, regardless of whose children we're talking about, and that all communities in that land should have access to the same things, the same rights? I believe it's easy to agree on that. As to how we get there, well, for starters, by not letting war criminals to get away with it, and to not let our government manipulate us and make us all complicit in horrendous crimes, because we do have power. And I feel that the most important realization among, as we are engaging with all of these issues and actions, is that this is beyond any doubt a generational shift. This is how I see it personally, as somebody who happens to be one of the oldest people involved with any of this, especially with regards to the Uncommitted campaign. The people who are very active and motivated and participate in all of these things have something in common. Most of them are really young, right? They may disagree on certain things, but they belong with a generation that has not much to lose at this point. And this is why they're fearless. Even with your initial question, there are some Democratic voters who are very scared of Trump. But overall, and this is not clearly an official research I have conducted, but based on my own experience, these tend to be much older voters, right? Because they have something to lose. They have some type of normalcy they identify with, and they see Trump as a threat. I see the younger generation as being fearless, precisely because they are the children of crisis. Think of their lives. They were born into or went to college during a global pandemic that devastated the whole world, economic crisis. This idea of the American dream is nobody's reality anymore, even like very basic middle class goals, like to get a house and a dog or a cat, in my case, right? To have a traditional family or any type of a family. People cannot afford to do that anymore. So this context of constant instability, uncertainty, and the lack of real representation as far as younger voices, younger Jewish voices, younger Muslim voices, younger American voices in general are concerned, is precisely the essence of everything we're witnessing. And this is why Gaza resonates, among other things. It's the lack of representation and this idea not only of freedom, but also of being visible, of being heard, of being recognized as existing. I would say that it is the attempted historical erasure of the identity of Palestine that apparently proves to be indestructible, right? And this is why it has become the global symbol that it is today. It was an attempted erasure of an identity. And I think on some level, subconsciously, many young people identify with this lack of any even acknowledgement that you exist, that you have a voice. So the generational shift is really important. And that's something I keep saying. I'm truly in awe with our students and the young people behind the Uncommitted movement. One of the accusations that are thrown around by the critics is that they don't know what they're talking about. They may mean well. Quite frankly, this is such ridiculous nonsense. This is a new type of literacy that exists only among young people.
Real quick, not to interrupt you, but I really hate when, the David Frums of the world, or these like old heads that are like really conservative will say, oh, well, what do young people know? And I'm like, well, if you're older, you can be too stuck in your ways to consider other possibilities or to see new threats or to see the ways in which things have to change for, a variety of reasons. Sometimes young people notice that more than their elders do.
Of course. And as I was saying before, there is a new type of literacy, and there are moments in history, right? Like we take a much longue durée approach here, like the printing revolution, or right when traditional literacy, to learn how to read and write, was like driving so many socioeconomic changes just because people were communicating differently. And that's what I observe among our students and the youth in general. It's like how they navigate social media, how they're able to mobilize and to, like, with zero money or funding, like organize whole campaigns, which makes the argument of like corruption and money in politics increasingly so less relevant, right? Because you don't need the money if you have that type of literacy. And like, for instance, podcasts such as yours is how people become informed these days. And sure, traditional media are controlled and like far from actually representing anybody or informing anybody. But increasingly so, young people do not like care about these types of media sources anymore, and they're looking for alternatives, and they can find these alternatives and create these alternatives. And also, as far as an understanding of international relations and all of these issues and the connectivity, right, the connections among all of these things is concerned, that's also a type of literacy that older generations don't have. Because again, it's the 21st century. We have reached a new stage of global integration. So our challenges are global. Environmental change, all of these disastrous wars, the fact that we are pouring chemicals that are going to destroy whole ecosystems for the decades to come, when the whole planet is really already in a very fragile state, like in dire straits. I mean, younger people do understand the science behind it, and I'm not sure older generations, quite frankly, do. I mean, they may hear the words, but somehow that doesn't seem to click with them. So from issues of equity, justice, how Kale made an excellent point about the New York encampment that Rutgers University, by the way, very conveniently tries to pretend it doesn't exist, right? Because they weren't able to force the community and the students out. And that's precisely because it speaks to a much, much broader dynamic, far from monolithic coalition of peoples and frustrations, right? Uncommit the Black vote, uncommit the Indigenous vote, uncommit the unhoused vote. I like all of these like slogans, but also actual tactics are connected, because we are all in this together. We are not represented, we are not given a voice, and we are not okay with it, really. So I was smiling before because I couldn't agree more with you. It drives me nuts when I hear this argument about how the kids, sure, they have their little slogans and they don't know what they're talking about. But as a professor of history, I have to say, these kids seem to be the only ones who know exactly what they're talking about, contrary to most other audiences. And that includes, unfortunately, many academics as well. I have to say, there are many who have been active and supporting all of these initiatives and realizing what's happening. But we do see a generational shift within academia as well, with a few very bright exceptions. Not everybody can be Norman Finkelstein, of course, right? There are some legendary thinkers within the Jewish movement for peace, within Jewish academia, within academia in general. There are some legendary pioneers, but overall, if we are to focus on like how majorities operate and articulate their frustrations and negotiate their agency, I think the generational shift is the most tangible realization or conclusion. Mm-hmm. And can I tell you something? I think the establishment should be very, very scared of what's happening here, because again, younger people have very little to lose the way they see it, and that makes them fearless. So these are interesting times.
Just before we close out, there were two things I want to cover briefly. I guess first, since you guys are at Rutgers University, there was recently that horrendous, and I would say UAC-like McCarthyite House Committee on Education and the Workplace uh, hearing where some of the professors at Rutgers were attacked, specifically professors associated with the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Juan Cole was attacked, who's a professor that I have a lot of respect for. We're seeing a lot of attacks on academics that stand up for Palestine. We're also seeing accusations that, oh, these students are being controlled in some way by outside forces. This isn't organic. It's an inorganic plot. This is real McCarthyite stuff, and I wanted you guys to be able to talk about the dangerous sort of McCarthyism we're seeing spread right now.
Yeah, I think a really interesting aspect of, I mean, this is a witch hunt, right? The meeting that was had in Congress to really try to put pressure on the president of our university. It just felt like chaos. It didn't seem like there was a clear, thought out strategy like there typically is in these types of committees. It just seems like it's going all over the place. Um, Something like this is the actions of people who are desperate, people who cannot win the argument on the facts. They can't even spin the argument on the facts. They just have to try to silence the conversation. Uh, I think it's a deep concern in a lot of ways. I think one of the deepest concerns is the conflation of the Jewish identity with the actions of Israel, which are genocidal. I mean, I think that's extremely damaging, and so it's a very cynical irony. Committees like this, actions like this, are doing the exact opposite of what they pledged to do. I mean, they're constantly talking about protecting Jewish people, but their conflation of the Jewish identity with their horrific crimes is doing more harm to Jewish people than I don't know what else in recent history.
We were we were having actually this conversation today with Kale. It is, you put it very well. It's precisely what it is, McCarthyism, and it's scary. We started to watch the hearing, and I quite frankly was unbearable. It was like so offensive that it was unbearable. And I personally think that we should do something more organized about it. We should address crimes that are committed. We should address lies that are weaponized to target whole groups. We should address the fact that Muslim students are getting attacked just for being Muslim, right? And in horrendous ways. We should address the fact that faculty is getting attacked violently by the police, elderly faculty with physical violence, or by the administration of different universities. People are getting fired, people are getting targeted, etc., etc. This constitutes criminal activity, and I think there should be something we should do in order to defend ourselves and our rights.
Well, while we wait for Elektra to come back, another point I thought about is the fact that I don't think it's anything accidental why this committee was directed at education, specifically universities. Uh,
I got it
Universities,
wrong earlier, by the way. I feel bad. It's the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. I think I said workplace, but same difference. Anyways, go on.
right? Yeah, movements that challenge and speak truth to power have very often arose in the younger population throughout history. And in the United States context, and in the context of many places in the world, they often arise at universities. And that's for many reasons. I mean, you have people who are young who um, have formal educations and the ability to find out what's the truth and to you know, come together and organize around the things that they are passionate about. And so waging the attack specifically against students, I mean, it's no accident, and I don't think it's an accident at all that the powers that are Zionist in the United States uh, that have become entangled with universities have for many decades put a lot of time and effort into silencing the voices of students on speaking out against this issue. Um, I think that these tactics work a lot better whenever they're not so visible, when they're silent. And at this point, the atrocities are so loud and they're so clear um, that you begin to see acts of desperation like this, where persons in powers try to scream from the mountaintops um, whatever they can to try to stop the conversation. I really think that's the epitome of what we're seeing in that committee.
Did you see the news, by the way? I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I thought it was an interesting news story that's been breaking the Israel's covert war on the ICC. So it's coming out now that for years they've been doing surveillance on the ICC over the ICC's probe into allegations of war crimes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I hadn't seen the news. It doesn't surprise me. The Israeli intelligence organization is a very developed, very funded organization that has its hands in basically every single place across the globe. Um, Israel has conducted covert actions against the United States for a long time. There was actually a case in 2016 where Mossad was discovered planting microphones around the White House in order to monitor the conversations of the president. Um, uh, there's been covert actions of the Israeli government in the United States to censor as much conversation through our platforms. And so it makes total sense that these institutional bodies that have a strong ability to point out the atrocities that Israel's able to commit, that Israel put its sights towards doing what it can to covertly um, um, destroy those institutions. I mean, this is the actions of dictators and autocrats. The point is to silence the conversation because if conversation can't be had whenever um, things become this brazen.
Yeah, and I was going to say for anyone interested in that story, it was covered by 972 in coordination with The Guardian and Local Call. So it's not, these are respectable publications that are covering this now. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, and whether or not Elektra comes back, we can also get her thoughts on this. But in regards to the issue of the connectivity of a lot of these issues that we're talking about, I think sometimes people don't realize a lot of the tactics that have been used against Gazans over the years were then imported over to the U.S. There's a whole book, The Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein, that deals with, how technology that was first used against Gazans is now being used in the U.S. Can you speak to just the way in which a lot of things that are happening over there come back to haunt us over here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I can. I think before this issue, a lot of people haven't been aware in the United States of how closely connected the institutions in the United States that are used to suppress people, to suppress voices in the United States are tied to Israel and the IDF. There's a very close bilateral connection where both parties um, work together to develop these mechanisms. I mean, the Palestinians at this point, what we're really looking at, it gets often talked about as two states. You have Palestine, you have Israel. But because Israel's occupied Palestine as thoroughly as it has, really what we're looking at is Israel that's taken over Palestine and imprisoned the Palestinian population. So the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel is really uh, the way that they treat prisoners. And you can look at the connection that the New York Police Department has, for instance, with the IDF. I mean, they conduct training together. They share technologies, buying drones, sharing intelligence. The Israeli intelligence organization Mossad has direct intelligence sharing processes with NYPD. So Israel has information and data collected by our law enforcement on American citizens. That is foreign intrusion. I mean, that is blatantly against. It's dangerous, quite frankly. And the types of tactics that are used by the NYPD, specifically against people who protest the genocide that Israel's committing and the atrocities Israel commits against Palestinians, are the same tactics that were trained to them by the IDF, using chemical weapons to disperse people, drones to survey, formation tactics in order to stop popular uprising protest, ways to be brutal, and to wage psychological warfare and to dissuade. So it's not just some distant connection. I mean, there's literally there's built-in systems and processes that are inextricable from law enforcement of the United States and Israel.
Elektra, since you're back, was there anything else you wanted to say about the McCarthyism issue, and then we'll close out?
Sorry, that was a very McCarthyian moment that I lost. Every time I'm about to say something about the CIA, this happens to me in classes, but I won't say anything about the CIA. The connections are obvious. No, but on the very important issue of like anti-Semitism, for instance, right? Again, I couldn't agree more. Kale puts it very well. I can't think of anything more anti-Semitic from denying the Jewish people or anybody really the right to individual self-determination, to decide what their identity means to them. And especially when we impose on them this identification with what's now beyond any doubt a genocidal regime and a historical paradigm that has been, quite frankly, disastrous to Judaism. And we can have a very long discussion about what all of this means. And this is one of the things that we were trying to do at the encampment, for instance, contrary to these usual accusations and the gaslighting that students don't know what they're talking about. We do have a People's University and a library, and one of the things that many of the students are doing is just engage in very nuanced ways with this situation. Again, as a historian, I feel very strongly that from the beginning, this manipulation of justified Jewish trauma after the Holocaust, right? And the manipulation of Jewish trauma that forced Jewish communities out of Europe, really, out of their historic lands. Not only they were collectively exterminated, not only by the Nazis. It's very well established that anti-Semitism was quite widespread. And we all know the infamous stories about the ships that were, sent back before reaching the US, et cetera, et cetera. Anti-Semitism was quite widespread. And when atrocities reached, at the time, this unprecedented, shocking levels, with the Nazis and the Holocaust and all that, what did we do back in Europe? Did we restore Jewish communities in their historic communities? Because this is how they identified up until that point, right? They identified themselves as Jewish people from France, from Greece, from England, from wherever they were. They felt European. They did not want to leave. And they were massacred in Russia. They were massacred in Western Europe. They were massacred everywhere. And after we reached the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust with World War II, what did the West and Russia, that's the only thing we seem to agree on, do to make up for our collective guilt? We officially deported Judaism from Europe. I don't think we talk enough about how twisted this story is, right? And we supported the most extremist and nationalist elements within that little religious community that up until that point, quite frankly, has been one of the most peaceful religions in the world. Christianity and Islam fought many wars. Judaism, for most of human history, was the religion of peace. So we supported, enabled the transformation of Judaism into a fully militarized, paranoid state that was surrounded by enemies and cannot exist in opposition and constant state of war against everybody else. And somehow we presented that as a gift to the Jewish people, as transforming them into a, quite frankly, not sustainable and definitely not secure or peaceful existence. Right from the outset, the roots of conflict were there, and that's undeniable, I believe, historically. And what we're witnessing right now is, I'll use the words of a Jewish staffer who just resigned, right? People resign almost every day at this point from the Biden.
You're talking about Lily Rose Greenberg from the State
exactly.
Department? Yeah.
So she's relatively young, and she was raised, according to her own words, in the Jewish faith in a very traditional way. And I think she puts it very nicely that you're making Judaism, my religion, my identity, the face of the American war machine that is devastating the world right now. And how is this going to work for my people, that you turn us into a genocidal, sad excuse of a political argument that is going to forever haunt us and turn everybody against us? And I think this is a very good point. The same way we send very often African Americans to go to the United Nations and vote against the whole world in favor of genocide, right? I think there's something really sinister about how we use vulnerable identities at times, not to enable them, but to make it easy for others to scapegoat them. And at some point, we have to stop just surrendering to gaslighting and the complete distortion of reality. Anti-Semitism is to put Jewish people in danger, to deny them the right to self-determination, to deny them the right to peace, to deny them the right to a religious identity that traditionally has been identified with way more intellectual engagement with the world than the other two monotheistic Abrahamic religions, like Christianity and Islam. We fought so many wars. We forced so many people to convert that was Islam and Christianity. We built empires. We did all of these things. We led violent nationalism. We identified with violent nationalism. Judaism is at this point, it's a very small community of people, 14 million people worldwide, who traditionally have been identifying with the opposite of war. And when they became the ultimate victim of everybody else's nationalism and hatred back in Europe, precisely because they didn't participate in that game of national clashes early on, I would argue, then we enabled, right, the transformation of that deep justified trauma in one of the most militaristic and disastrous now identities in the world that is destroying the soul of Judaism, according to many Jews. And on top of that, we're telling them that you don't have the right to say that, because then you are an anti-Semite. So if your understanding of Judaism translates into peace and inclusion and justice, you are an anti-Semite. If your understanding of Judaism translates into defending a paranoid state that is currently committing a genocide that is going to ultimately destroy it, then you're a true Semite. It's nonsensical. And at some point, we have to say no to all of these things.
So I want to thank both of you for coming on Parallax Views. What do you want to say in closing, and how can my listeners keep up with the Uncommitted campaign?
I want to say June 4th is a very, very important day, regardless of what you choose to do, during the elections in November. If you live in New Jersey and you feel that, democracy means participating actively in negotiating our representation rather than just surrendering it to whomever happens to be in power, please come out and vote. if you could share our website with your viewers, that would be great, because it's very detailed. It provides information as to how people can navigate everything. It's very, very simple. So the primaries are all about just giving a loud message to the Biden administration. And it's very simple. We, the American voters, are not okay with committing a genocide. It should be a non-brainer, I believe, especially for people who allegedly identify with democracy and human rights. June 4th is the date that we should all keep in mind.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. As always, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, I should note, I don't know what's going to be going on with my advertising on this show going forward, as Wall Street Window is retiring, at least the website is. I believe the mighty Mike Swanson is moving over to a mailing list system. I don't know if he'll still be advertising with me or not. We'll see, but I highly suggest you sign up to Mike's mailing list in any case, and hopefully we can continue an advertising relationship. But if not, I may have to do a big fundraising push for this show, or potentially paywall a lot more of the content. And I'm not big on that second one, so hopefully we can do a fundraising effort. I could really use your support. Patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.